Kia ora. My name is Brooke Darrow. I'm a videographer and cinematographer originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now based in London.
Welcome to the Real Riders Podcast. My name's Simon Josie, and this is the podcast about motorcycling and filmmaking. If this is your first time here, welcome and thanks for listening. As you heard, my guest for today's episode is Brooke Darrow, a fellow New Zealander, which means you're in for a treat of New Zealand vowels. You're welcome. Before we get to the interview with Brooke, there are a few terms and place names that come up in the interview that I want to explain. The initials NZTA stand for New Zealand Transport Agency, or Waka Kotahi in Māori. It's a New Zealand Crown entity tasked with promoting safe and functional transport by land, including the responsibility for driver and vehicle licensing, and administering the New Zealand State Highway Network. Waka Kotahi means one vessel, and is intended to convey the concept of travelling together as one. If you didn't already know, Aotearoa is the Māori language name for New Zealand. It's most commonly translated into English as the land of the long white cloud. In our conversation, Brooke makes several references to Makara, where some of the footage in her film Faster Than Fear was shot. Makara is an area located on the western edge of Wellington, right on the southwestern tip of New Zealand's North Island. Miramar is a suburb in Wellington and generally considered to be the heart of New Zealand's filmmaking industry. It's home to Peter Jackson's film empire, the guy who did The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, etc., and the famous Weta Workshop. Brooke also made reference to rollers, which is an abbreviation for the term rolling shot, a technique where a camera operator films a moving subject, most commonly a vehicle, from another moving vehicle. Brooke also referred to a couple of camera models, the FX3, which is the Sony FX3, and the C300 is the Canon C300. Just before we get to Brooke, there are a few other things that I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, Trail Worn Films has begun releasing a new series on their YouTube channel. The first film in the series is based on their journey through northern Portugal. Go check it out. Abel, Harry and George from Trail Worn Films were my guests on episode 42. Damian Rowley, who we know as Demon Rides, and former Real Riders guest, was a guest on the most recent episode of the Binge Moto podcast. That was episode 27. Go have a listen, or a watch if that's your preference, because it's on YouTube as well. Damian is appearing as a speaker at festivals this summer, including the ABR and the Armchair Adventure Festival. Note both those festivals are in the UK. My episode 45 guest, Dave Perry from YouTube channel Wheelie Good TV, has launched his website, and as you would expect, it looks very slick. You can find it by searching for Wheelie Good TV or typing www.thewheeliegoodwebsite.com. Oh, and another thing, Dave has purchased the latest GoPro camera, the Mission 1, and has been testing it extensively. Check out Wheelie Good TV on YouTube to see the results of his tests. Finally, one other thing. Who else noticed in the last episode of Real Riders that my guest Angelo, or Noob as we call him, slipped some Smiths lyrics into the chat? Perhaps that's something my guest should aspire to do. Slip song lyrics into the conversation and see whether I notice. Consider it a challenge, future guests. Don't forget, you can find the Real Riders podcast on Instagram, where I post, amongst other things, trailers for each new episode. And if you want to know what I've been watching recently, I occasionally post about that on Blue Sky. Links for both the Instagram and Blue Sky accounts can be found in the show notes. Finally, if you want to help keep the servers running, pumping out the episodes, you can now support the podcast via Buy Me a Coffee donations. I have a few operational costs associated with hosting and remote recording infrastructure, and any donations go towards paying for those. The link is in the show notes and also in my link tree, which you can find in my Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube account profiles. Finally, righto, let's get to my talk with Brooke. Kia ora, Brooke. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being my guest. How's it going?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm fighting the urge not to talk about the weather, but I know that London's been having a bit of a heat wave, and
Oh,
we've had a bit of a heat wave here too. So,
it has been incredible. We spent the last, I want to say 3 or 4 days in 33-degree weather, but it's not a standard 33-degree weather. It feels like you're being choked by a wet towel. It's quite, quite abrasive.
yeah. I remember going down into the tube. It wasn't 30s, but it would have been mid to late 20s. This is a long time ago, the tube in London, and being horrified that there was like no air conditioning in the tube and just thinking, how do people live here? Yeah.
No, nothing's changed since then, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So that's the weather talk over and done with. I'm going to jump in with my first question. I have to shout out my old employer, Radio New Zealand, or RNZ as they like to call themselves these days, for bringing you to my attention. I heard you interviewed following your recent success at the 2026 London International Student Film Festival, where you picked up the award for Best Documentary for your film Faster Than Fair. Congratulations on winning that award.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can start off by you telling me what that film is about.
Yeah, sure. Faster Than Fair is very much a passion project for me. Despite doing it through my master's, I went into my master's kind of with the idea of making this film, which is all about this liminality between adrenaline and grief. And talking with a lot of people in the motorcycling community, especially in Wellington, which is where I learned, everything. There is this sort of taboo nature to the topic, talking about people who have injured themselves or have passed away on the road. People don't like to talk about it, but it's always kind of there. It's always acknowledged, but not directly. And so this film is, in a way, a challenge to that, to allow those who are in the community to, silently or loudly deal with that grief that they might be holding, but also for those who are in surrounding families or friends to get a glimpse into what the community actually means for these people. Because if you haven't been on the back of a bike or, gone out on a big group ride or these meetups, it's quite a foreign land, and you don't truly get a glimpse into it as you might do, watching this film or being in the community yourself. So it was, kind of allowing both sides to have a moment to sit with these thoughts and express maybe some of these feelings that haven't been talked about before.
I know that you ride yourself. What came first, the idea for the film, or did the film idea come out of your own personal experience of riding?
They sort of, in a way, moved together. I've always had an interest pursuing motorcycling because my dad and my older brother were very much into it when they were kids, and they all used to ride around the paddocks on their motocross bikes and going over jumps and things. And I can remember when I was, quite little, saying to my mom and dad, well, you're going to have to teach me when I'm older because my two brothers are doing this. Come on, you can't leave me out. But then we ended up moving out of the, lifestyle block sort of farm area when I was 11. And so I never got the opportunity to learn to do those things. And it's always been in the back of my mind because I never understood the allure or the pull towards it. So when I was 21, I decided that I would buy my own motorcycle because I had a bunch of savings saved up. And then my master's was that year afterwards. And so going through the community and getting to really understand these people better, I wanted to be able to tell that story more because I think that it often isn't talked about enough, especially in New Zealand, where it's quite a prolific community. And often, as somebody that just commuted by car before, you don't see them all the time, which is terrible. So, just trying to make them feel more seen. And in a way, the ideas sort of moved together, it just felt very natural.
Mm. I'm assuming that you ride on the road, or is that a wrong assumption?
Yes, yeah, road.
Okay. And has that always, well, apart from sort of seeing the brothers doing the motocrossing, have you always sort of gravitated towards road riding?
I think so. And perhaps this is just a hot take or just my own opinion, but I really enjoy the look of road bikes as opposed to motocross, which are, a bit more naked. They have the huge wheels with I don't know what the name for them is, like the ribbed kind of nature to them. I've
Okay.
always found it a bit too aggressive for me. And road bikes are super sleek. There's some personality to it. There's personality to the gear that you wear. And that expression, I think, was really important to me going into it.
Hmm. It probably lost, I don't know, half my listeners, but that's okay. Like,
I'm so sorry.
no worries.
I truly do appreciate it, especially after talking with Courtney Duncan about her women's motocross championship. There is so much skill that goes into it that a lot of people, such as myself, maybe didn't understand before, talking to her about it. But it's an acquired taste, and I respect it so much.
Yeah. Like my impression coming, having lived obviously in New Zealand growing up, that our road toll, the number of people who are killed or severely injured on New Zealand roads is quite high relative to our population. I mean, is that still something that is prominent in most New Zealanders' minds, do you think?
I I would say so, just from the people that I've talked to about it, and my own thoughts going into this project as well, especially in the pre-production, sort of pitching this film before I had even brought it to my masters to as an idea. I approached NZTA just to kind of get their thoughts about it, how might be best to approach it with quite an empathetic, open lens, but also one that's realistic to what's happening. And I didn't want to inflate this view that it was worse than it was, or it wasn't as bad as it was. And when I sat down and had a conversation with them, yeah, they showed me all of the statistics, and it was really quite eye-opening, especially because these two people that were talking to me about it didn't ride themselves, and they could acknowledge objectively, this is where we're at as a country. And I think that for me was a huge step into this conceptualization, because it made me take a step back from, you know, learning how to ride at the time, and really noticing this is what people are grasping with every day. This is what I'm putting myself at risk for every time I get on the road. And in that way, motocross maybe doesn't seem so dangerous.
Yeah, because that was kind of where I was trying to go rather obliquely, is that road riding has a risk profile and motocross has a risk profile. And those risk profiles are completely different, but I think deserve serious attention in both cases. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you have a firm idea of what you wanted the film to be about, or did you approach it in a way that was open to discovering what the story was going to be as you went through, particularly as you went through the process of the interviews?
With documentary filmmaking, I'd say you have to maintain a sense of fluidity, because going into the interviews, you can ask people questions, much like you might sit down at a podcast, but you have absolutely no idea where it's going to go, what they might say, the stories they might tell you. And in a sense, half your questions might not even be relevant anymore. And so there was this sense of fluidity that I went into in all of the interviews, but there was always this motif that I wanted to keep, which was, talking about risk and what that meant to the individual riders, but also in like a more competitive sense, because Aaron Slight and Courtney Duncan are obviously world renowned. They've been at the absolute top of their game. And that was an interesting perspective to get. And one that was quite unexpected, being that Courtney is at the height of her game, maybe doesn't want to think about that stuff so much. And Aaron has had the time to sit with it and really evaluate how it is that he feels about it. So there were interesting perspectives that I hadn't imagined going that way. And so in post-production, we had to shape the story around these beautiful narratives that we found. So pitching a documentary film definitely isn't as straightforward as you think it might be, because you don't really know where it's going to go, but very, very rewarding. And I think that the narrative that we got in the end was informative and also empathetic.
I guess you have to be very careful of imposing a narrative before you discovered what that narrative is, right?
Absolutely. And part of it as well was that I wanted this film to be something that everybody could take away a different message from. You could choose to take some of it on board or leave it if you really didn't want to. But it was about creating conversation. And so if people could leave the cinema and have opposing views and be able to talk about why it is that they felt that way, that was an absolute win in my book. I don't think any documentary which tells you to feel a certain way isn't doing what it's supposed to do.
I wondered, did you ever ask Aaron, so Aaron Slight, former World Superbike rider, or Courtney Duncan, 4 times women's world motocross champion, did you ask them what their attitude was to riding motorcycles on the road?
I did. Aaron had an interesting perspective because he obviously, raced World Superbike. And so he was already very well versed in what that meant about riding on a track and road being, very similar surfaces. But he was very aware, and he said this a few times through the interview, of riding like you're a ghost. And not everybody is going to see you, but you have to be aware that nobody sees you. And so that was an interesting perspective compared to Courtney, who I did ask this as well, but obviously her main area is motocross. But she's been trying to learn to do some road riding, which was really interesting to hear. And she was talking to me about it, because they're very different practices. And so she's still, learning to get all the road rules and such. So that was really humbling. And she, I think, was kind of where I was at the time, still learning about this community and about what it means to ride on the road and the risks that are inherent to that. So I think it's just learned experience. And I think Aaron had definitely had that learned experience in the interview.
Before I divert away too much from your own motorcycling, I have to ask, what type or types of riding are you drawn to?
I'm definitely more drawn to road riding. And there was a time, especially kind of halfway through this documentary, where I really wanted to get into track riding. I'd bought this beautiful full leather suit and I was so excited to, learn proper cornering. And nobody talks about how difficult it is to throw yourself on the side of the bike and get that balance. It's so under talked about, and just the strength and the endurance that you have to have for it, so underrated. So I was trying to, get to that point, but then, didn't get the opportunity to move to beautiful London. But when I did ride on the road, my first bike was a Suzuki Gixxer 250. And then once I felt like I'd, learned the basics, which is, in my opinion, probably a harder bike to learn on just because of the weight distribution, it felt quite heavy. And then I moved to a Ninja 400, which wasn't a huge step up, but it felt enough for me. I didn't need anything faster than that. It was quite a nippy bike. And so I found it super fun just being able to, commute to my university on my pink motorcycle. It was very cool.
Okay. You're living in London now. You've been there for 3 months. Are you riding anything currently, or are you going crazy because you can't ride?
Oh my gosh. Again, nobody talks about this. It's not FOMO. It's this integral feeling in your soul that you don't have a motorcycle and you see all these beautiful bikes down the street. And I can remember one day turning to my partner and being like, that's a that's a Ducati RSV4 or a Panigale. And I felt like I turned into my worst nightmare because I always used to ridicule those people that were pointing out all these cars or bikes and saying how cool they were. So I'm definitely getting that withdrawal. It's hit me like a truck. Yeah.
Right. Do you have any plans to do anything about that while you're in London?
I would absolutely love to. I have a mild fear about getting my bike stolen because that petty theft is a huge deal here.
Yeah.
But gosh, I would love to. It's definitely on my bucket list. But I'll have to fly back to Aotearoa and pick up my helmet and my boots because I those are the things that I kept.
And of course, Europe is just on your doorstep when you're living in London as well. So, yeah. And you've got Scotland and Wales and yeah. And those are places that I haven't been to yet, but I've seen a little bit of Europe and yeah. Okay. Back to the film. You interviewed Courtney Duncan and Aaron Slight and also Garth Mitchell, who's a senior mechanic with Wellington firm Independent Motorcycles Limited. How did you identify these subjects? How did you approach them? Did it take much to convince them to participate in the film?
There's always a bit of negotiation that goes into getting people to be part of something like this. We're pretty lucky in New Zealand that there is this fantastic 2 degrees of separation. And so I believe it was Grant Wolford at Cycle Spot that we'd approached first. And he just had all of these incredible contacts through the country because he's kind of been in the game for so long. And so he got me in touch with Aaron and Courtney, which is, great to get an email or a phone number, but that's only half of the work. And so from there, I spent, I want to say maybe a month negotiating with both of them about how it was that they wanted to approach the documentary, what they wanted to say, what their ethics and their ethos were around it. So there was a bit of negotiation that people don't really see. And then ultimately, before the film was delivered, it was making sure that they were comfortable with their contributions and things like that. And so we kind of did have to, do some informal contracts in a way to make sure that they were represented the best that they could be. But I think that respect is, very, very basic. You'd hope that you went into it with that level of understanding.
You also interviewed, or not really interviewed, but you had sort of a voice clip or on a bit of footage actually of one young rider. And if I'm not wrong, it's 15-year-old Isabel Smith.
Yes.
I thought she shared some really interesting insights about riding, racing, specifically about the sense of calm that overcomes her when she's riding because she feels in complete control of the motorcycle. And I'm wondering if you had considered featuring her more simply because she was so articulate and clear about particularly the mental relationship with motorcycling, or was it a case of, great talent, and by talent I mean on-screen talent, but anything more from her wouldn't have served the film's story?
Yeah, Izzy was an incredible woman to have interviewed. Being so young, I was just so surprised at how articulate she was, and watching her go around the track. I mean, that entire family just has so much talent. I was in absolute awe because I wish I was that cool when I was 15. But yeah, she shared these incredibly mature remarks. Yeah, like you say, about calmness and being in complete control. And I think having that confidence when you're 15 just makes so much difference, especially if you're going into motorcycling in a competitive way, like she is. We had considered featuring her more, and kind of the only reason why we didn't was that it maybe hindered the application of Aaron and Courtney kind of being juxtaposed with quite a young rider. Also, our audio for that clip wasn't great. As you can imagine, being at the Manfield track day, everything was very loud, and we just didn't have the appropriate gear that we probably should have had to conduct on-site interviews. So it was a mix of both of those things, but gosh, I would have loved to see her more. a lot of people found her such an endearing character. And yeah, she was just, yeah, so articulate. I was in awe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she sort of hinted at what motorcycling, it reduces her anxiety that she maybe experiences in other parts of her life because she feels she's in complete control of the motorcycle. It's a remarkable clip, and I'm glad that despite the poor audio, that you kept it in with you had captions, subtitles. So yeah, I could see a whole documentary being made about her. I'm sure that's occurred to you as well. Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Give it a couple of years, and I reckon we're going to be seeing her on some international world stage. She's so talented.
Yeah. Keep an eye out for that, people, for sure. In what order did you actually shoot the footage? And by the footage, I mean the interviews, the track footage, and then the other road riding footage.
Yeah, I would have to rack my brain a little bit. We started filming this in, I want to say, August of 2025. So this was, 3 or 4 months into pre-production. And our first shoot, I believe, was out in Makata, getting our opening shots and some of the more cinematic visuals that carry a motif. And the reason why it took 3 or 4 months to get there was because it was a logistical nightmare. And we spent a month and a half just getting the permissions from Screen Wellington to shoot in that area. But the issue was mainly because it's one straight road, Makata. You don't have any turning points or roundabouts. And so we had to draw up these really elaborate mud maps to send through to them and get feedback and then come back and redraw them up again. And I can appreciate them being thorough because otherwise our only other solution was to go through and essentially get, roadmen out there to have stop-go signs for all the traffic that was going through and completely shut down the road. And that would have put us another $2 or $3 grand over budget. We just couldn't do that. And so we had to essentially agree to do these really long 15, 20-minute takes, driving down Makata to the beach and then all the way back up several times. And so the permissions for that were really difficult. And then the shoot day came, and it being Wellington, it's incredibly windy. And so we had planned out all these beautiful drone shots, which we did get some of them on one of the shoot days. But we also didn't capture a lot of footage that was, shot listed out and storyboarded and things. So we kind of just had to work with it. But that was probably our more difficult shoot day out of all of them, which is funny because that's what we started with. So it couldn't get harder from there. And then after Makata, I believe we went to Manfield and Fielding to go and shoot the community track day. That was slightly less difficult because we were coordinating straight with the Manfield team, and they were just so incredibly accommodating. Yeah, such a lovely community of people that work in around that. And our only main point of contention was in the Manfield track community days. They have about an hour for lunch where they completely shut down the track. They don't have anybody supervising it. And I was, trying to suggest that maybe we could take that hour and go out there with our drone operator, Jerry's very high-speed drone, and follow somebody around the track quite closely. Again, there's a lot of safety preparation that goes into something like that. And we were kind of asking this more on the day, which, I probably shouldn't have done. And they were all just like, oh, that would be so awesome. Like, yes, we should absolutely do. And I was so blown away. I was not expecting a response like that at all. And so we got on all our high vis. We sent Chappie out there to do some laps around Manfield. And the footage that came out of that was just so cool. It was so awesome, and it was so last minute. Stuff like that, you can't script it. And then from there, we shot all of the 3 interviews. And we started with Aaron, and then to Courtney, and then to Garth. It's the last one.
So tell me about those interviews. Like, did you have a set of questions and you go, question 1, bingo? Or did you try to be, this is something I try to practice in podcasting, though you may not notice, this idea of being open to going where the conversation goes. Like, how structured or unstructured were those interviews with Aaron and Courtney and Garth?
Hmm. When you're directing a documentary like this with subjects that are so well versed with their subjects and their topics, you kind of have to go in with a certain level of understanding that matches that. And so my initial questions to them were definitely structured. There were things that I wrote down, but they were kind of more like topic lines. And so when you're sitting with somebody, especially in a room full of cameras and lights, you kind of have to build this sense of comfortability. So we'd press record and then we would talk about things for a while until you could kind of see their shoulders drop and they started breathing normally again. And that's kind of when you try to slide back into the topic of motorcycling and really try to get them to express things as naturally as they could. We found this a lot with Garth's interview as well, as an example. We had started off our filming, asking him to tell us about mechanicship and maybe talking us through what he might do for, the average check on a bike that comes through. And so, he showed us all these things. You could tell that he was, in a space that he was really comfortable with. Essentially, eventually we sat him down and he starts talking to us more about it. And then you just start feeding him a couple of questions. And you just notice this change in demeanor, and they become super calm, and it just feels like you're having a conversation. And that's a really hard place to get to, especially when you're, interviewing in a documentary and you have all of this months of preparation behind and they know what's to come, but you still have to get them to that point. So there was a bit of asking them questions that I'd thought about beforehand, but it was also really actively listening and really sitting back with what they're saying and letting them have space to continue what they're saying. And so not always jumping in with the next thing. And so I'd, make little notes or little mental notes as we're going along, trying not to, look too intimidating. But it's kind of all about reading body language when you're in a room like that, which I think is one of the more important skills. Yeah.
How much experience of doing that? I mean, you sound like an expert, but bloody hell, you can't be. You're too young for that. But like before this project, how much experience had you had of conducting an interview on film, on screen?
I've surprisingly had a bit of experience sort of here and there. When my grandparents were getting older, I'd sat them both down and interviewed them about their lives. And you kind of had to do a similar thing of, making sure that you're not asking them questions that are too uncomfortable straight away, because you can acknowledge that they know that they're getting older and they know that there's a reason why you're interviewing them. And from there, I ended up working with a small company in Wellington who kind of did a similar thing. And they were creating these memorial videos or kind of pre-memorialization, I suppose, for families that wanted to keep that legacy of those that around them that were, sick or getting older. And when you're in a space like that you have a lot of empathy and sensitivity for these people that you're talking to, you kind of get to understand how it is that you need to approach things, or how you change your tone of voice, or how you're sitting, because people pick up a lot, especially when you're directing them or talking direct to them. They really pick up on your comfortability. And so it's about being able to, especially, with such sensitive material like Garth's interview, there were a couple of moments where I just wanted to cry, because the stuff that he was telling me about was just incredibly moving. And I still cry when I watch the film, because I remember how I felt when I was sitting in that room.
Mm.
But you kind of have to do this hard thing where you remove yourself from it all. And I think that's the hard skill that not a lot of people can get to, but it's just so valuable. It's being able to read people like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially on film. Like I'm just thinking now, I think I do a little bit of this. Like today, we probably talked 20 minutes before I hit record. And recently I've been doing a couple of record interviews with the people that I've interviewed. Like I call it a tech check, where we just, particularly if someone who hasn't done this kind of thing, maybe an older person, they're not necessarily going to be initially comfortable with this kind of recording. And so I like to have a chat, but it's also good for me because it means I get to, because there are often people that I maybe have seen on screen, but I haven't had any sort of other relationship with. And so it's nice to have a call, first of all, with that person to actually get comfortable with the tech, but get comfortable with each other before we have this interview. We didn't do that, but we did, like I say, spend 20 minutes beforehand because I thought, a young person, they'll know what to do with all the tech, no problem. But I kind of deliberately did make sure that we had a bit of chat beforehand before pushing the record. And that's mainly to get you comfortable. And
Absolutely.
to show that I'm not so horrendous. But I think what you've been doing in terms of having to get those people relaxed on camera, to me that seems much harder to actually get people relaxed on camera. Because it's one thing, like I have done some of these recordings where I've offered people, hey, we're talking some sensitive stuff, do you want to turn the camera off? And they've said, yeah, actually I would appreciate that. And so cameras have been off and we've just still recorded the interview. And that, to me, as someone who does this, seems a lot easier than what you're doing because the camera's on. I mean, I hate having cameras on me, and I find it very difficult to be comfortable when the camera's on. So I mean, how long did those interviews take, actually, those 3 interviews?
Funnily enough, Courtney's was the quickest. I think it was a 40-minute interview. And I was definitely struggling towards the end because despite her telling me that she wasn't media trained, she had an answer for everything straight away. And it made my job a lot easier in editing, but also there's a lot of beauty of, getting to sit there with somebody and watch their expression change. And you'll find that a couple of times in the documentary, it gets a little bit quiet and you can kind of see them sitting with their thoughts. Aaron and Garth, I would say Aaron was the next longest after that, maybe an hour, and then Garth probably took an hour and a half.
Yeah, it's funny you say about them sitting with their thoughts because there's a couple of very deliberate, long sort of pauses after they've given some answers, and I really like that pacing of you can see. In fact, Aaron, who is kind of a smiley guy, his smile just kind of dissolves, and it's just sort of like you see a completely different side of him as he moves out of that happy, jovial, talking kind of guy to, oh yeah, I can be kind of a serious guy as well. And his face just completely changes. Was there a particular style? And I guess I'm thinking really a lot about the interviews, but we can talk more broadly about style. Was there a particular style that you wanted to achieve? And if we look at the interviews, I noticed that you used 2 camera angles with the interviews. But with both of those angles, the subject is not looking directly into the camera. It's either quite a way off. I'm not sure what the degree of angle it is. And the other one, it's sort of almost like the camera is on the shoulder, but not the eyes of the interviewer, but on the shoulder of the interviewer. So again, it's a little bit off center. We also don't hear or see the interviewer. Like we don't, if you were the interviewer, we don't hear or see you in the film at all. So those are very deliberate decisions. What was the thinking behind that approach as opposed to other approaches? Like there are other, I happened to watch a documentary last night on Netflix, and the subject was interviewed very close, eyes on the camera, and that was very powerful. But again, that's a very deliberate decision. So tell me about your decisions and the approach that you wanted and the style that you wanted to take.
Yeah. In order to talk about this a little bit, I'm going to have to give a little academic tidbit. Because when we talk about documentary filmmaking, we talk about this construct by Bill Nichols called the modes of documentary. And it has things like expository and poetic and observational and things like this. And it's sort of the style of documentary similar to how you'd have sci-fi or sci-fi dramas, and you can have a mix of all of these modes as well. So when we're in pre-production for this documentary, we're talking a lot about the mode or the shape and the form that we want this documentary to have. And part of that was not wanting to impose onto people, a preconceived meaning, kind of like we talked about earlier. And so it needed this observational lens to it in order to capture that. We wanted people to feel like they were sitting in the same room, but not necessarily like they were being talked at or told to feel a certain way. And so me not being in there as a voice was a deliberate choice, maybe because I'm not as much of a specialist in this topic as Aaron or Courtney or Garth might be. And so I didn't want my voice to impose that meaning. But I also wanted people to feel like they were sitting in that room and being the one that were asking the questions, maybe. In terms of the 2-camera setup, having the 2 cameras was a practicality. It allows people in post-production to edit audio together more clearly with the visuals. But having them in that setup, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because not a lot of people acknowledge that, I suppose, that the angles that they're set up. A wide shot was really important to me because I wanted people to be able to see the environment that they're in, the space that they inhabit, but also, their broader, wider body language. You'll notice a lot in the interviews, somebody might be sitting back with their arms crossed. They might be a little bit more uncomfortable with the things they're talking about, or they might be sitting a lot more open, showing that they're super comfortable and confident. But then having that close-up shot from the side, it makes you see them in a different way, because you don't see people talking at you in that way, I suppose. And so that's where our observational mode comes in, is you feel like you're in the room with this person who's sharing all these really deep and meaningful things, but it's not imposing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you didn't do that. There's that trend in corporate video, which one of my former guests alerted me to, and ever since I've seen it, I've thought, yeah, I really don't like that, where the subject is speaking directly to the camera, and then you switch to a camera which is almost like 90 degrees of their face, talking, in the other, and it just seems so contrived. Whereas what you did seemed a lot more natural.
Thank you.
Yeah. I thought, in fact, it took me a couple of goes. I need to watch something several times to realize what you were doing there, because it seemed natural. I liked the way it worked. What about the rest of the film in terms of the shots of the road riding and the track riding? How much of your own experience of motorcycling informed your storyboarding and selection of shots for those sequences?
I'd say a bit of my experience informed those things, in terms of somebody with a background in cinematography and understanding how things have to be shot in order to look good in a final edit. So in a way, my personal education formed a lot of those choices, but I was also extremely aware throughout the whole process that, I'm a young woman who has only been riding bikes for, a year or two. And so I can't form the whole perspective in this film from my perspective, because that's, it's very niche. And a lot of people have been in this game for years, and there's a lot of history to it. And so part of this film was, this extraordinary pre-production period of really making sure that I was educated on a whole range of perspectives of people who have never faced grief or have never faced injury or things like this on the road, as well as those who have. And equally, it's a huge part of both of their lives. So it was about informing myself really first, so that I could make informed decisions later on. But I guess for me, even during those scripted sort of sequences in Makara, I always had this through line of community. And so because, August was quite early in our production even, I sort of had to make things quite broad in terms of the things that we shot. And so we had this through line of a rider who was gearing up to go off on this ride around Makara, beautiful scenery. And they get joined by their friends on the road. Incredibly cheesy. But then when we pulled it in with all these shots, with the interviews and our subjects and things, it gives a lot of inherent meaning to it. You watch the intersection where they've all met up go dark, as Garth talks about a friend that he's lost. And it's things like this that you can only imagine once everything is finished. And so while we had quite a clear plan of how we wanted this film to feel and how we wanted it to go, you also can't prepare yourself for everything. And so you have to have a level of trust that things are going to come together in the end.
One of the themes that's quite common when I speak to professionals who have many years of experience is how efficient they are with capturing the footage they need for the project they're working on, as opposed to quite often, should we say, amateur or hobbyist filmmakers who often will click the GoPro on and the GoPro is running for hours and they get back and they've got hours and hours and hours of footage to deal with. How much footage that you shot went in the bin? And you talked about storyboarding, so and you had a big crew, right? So you had a lot of people's time to consider. How efficient were you in terms of capturing just exactly what you needed?
That's a great question, because not a lot of people see the preparation that goes into, storyboarding and shot listing and things, but especially the Makara shoot. We knew exactly what we're going in for. We had the size of the lenses written down on each shot. Like, that was very precise. We were using our time as effectively as we could with the weather that we had. It did start raining at one point, and that kind of put us back like an hour or two. But what can you do? Longer lunch. Nobody's complaining. So it was fun. But the interviews, they were hard to cut down in editing because, we couldn't anticipate what exactly was going to happen. And so on set, we'd have somebody, making note of the time code and writing down interesting points that they found through the interview. And so we could, give those notes to our editor. They could watch it down, give their own opinion, but also jot down all these little time marks, I suppose, through the interview. And that kind of helped speed up the process quite a lot. But at Manfield, probably captured 5 hours of footage, 5 or 6, because we had 2 drones, we had our main camera, and they were kind of just going the entire day capturing all this beautiful footage. And so finding all those tiny little moments that were the gold in between all of it was so difficult. The post-production process for this film was not easy, because as much as I so loved getting there at Manfield and just being able to shoot motorcycles all day, it was lovely. I had so much fun. Sitting down and looking back through and digesting all of that information and all of the footage was such a process. And I was so lucky that the editor that worked on this, Jack Gosling, was just very methodic and very particular about all of the footage that he grabbed out. And so we'd sit in the edit suite. Sometimes I think one day we sat in there for over 10 hours together. And that was a lot. But we had to look at everything. And so even though we've gone out there and had this magnificent day and shot 5 or 6 hours of footage, you have to watch all of that again. And so if I were to do this film all over, I would probably be more particular about that one day that we shot, because it set us back quite a lot. The interviews, you can't help being that long, and we ended up watching them through several times. So you can imagine how much time that took.
Yep.
And then Makara went very well. So yeah, there are parts that I'd learned from the shoot, but with what I knew at the time and with what we had, I would say we did we did the best that we could. Yeah, and I'm so proud.
Was there any overlap between, if we talk about this three, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of three stages of filmmaking: pre-production, shooting, post-production. Were those three stages distinct in time, or was there some overlap?
They were relatively distinct in time, in terms that we'd have our pre-production, and then when we start shooting, people would be like, okay, we're in production, we're shooting. But even when you're in production, you're still getting some consents if you haven't got them already, or, negotiated with the people that you're interviewing with time or things like that. Post-production can be a little bit hazy. There was definitely a clear point where we'd stopped shooting and we could just focus on all of the information that we were digesting. But there was also an overlap where every day after you've shot, you'd put together what we call dailies. And it's just essentially all of the things that you've shot that day. And you might note down particular things that maybe, like our note takers had taken from the interviews. Or you might not, and you might let it sit there for a week and then come back to it. There's always a little bit of haze, but for us, I think those three stages were relatively pretty clear. Like, we had a timeline set out for those things, and we completed everything on time, which was such a treat when you put in the work to make sure that it stays on track.
Were there any specific challenges, apart from the Wellington wind and rain? Anything that you didn't like, any major sort of challenges that you hadn't foreseen at the pre-production stage? I guess I'm thinking, because things typically go haywire during shooting or in post-production, right? So did you have any major challenges?
I think we were relatively lucky with the practical shooting of things. One of the major challenges was we had all these beautiful rollers that we shot out in Makata, and they were logistically a bit hard to figure out as well, because our initial plan was to have this wonderful car rig where we could essentially, buckle this relatively small camera into a huge gimbal to stabilize everything on maybe the hood of the car or around the boot of the car. But for whatever reason, and I can't entirely remember, we just couldn't get the gear that we needed. So we had to come up with a backup plan. And I'm not sure how badly I want to admit this, but we had a very ad hoc sort of setup where we had a couple of hatchbacks, which we'd swapped between on the different days. We'd opened up the boot, but we'd bungeed it so that it stayed where it was. And we had the FX3 camera on an RS3 Pro gimbal on one of those huge frames. And we'd strapped it into the boot with the boot open. And we'd put a couple of the seats down in the back of the hatchback. And we had our camera operator essentially strapped in, by the way, with a seatbelt, either looking out the back through the seats that were put down, kind of making sure that everything was going okay. Or the second setup was that we'd had it strapped in the back of the boot with all of the seats up, 5 people in the car. We had a director, a driver, we had our focus puller, and an audio person, and then also somebody who was controlling the gimbal. It was a lot of people in a very small space, getting a little bit angry at each other because, the camera operator is going, well, you need a focus pull to, where I'm looking. And the focus puller is going, well, you need to tilt your camera up a little bit because I can't see everything. So it's funny looking back at it, but at the time, there was definitely a lot of tension. And being that person that kind of just has to sit there and go, we'll laugh about this soon. It's hard.
And are you satisfied with the results in terms of, when you look back now, it was worth all that trouble to get those shots of the rolling the footage? Because, I go on about this all the time on the podcast to say those are often the killer shots, because to get shots of someone riding a bike relatively close up while they're moving, you can't do it in any other way. And it takes a lot of effort to achieve that well, generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And not enough people talk about the person that's driving the car as well, because we were shooting out the back of the boots. We were filming these riders front on. And our main rider, Sasha, he he had a lot of confidence. He rode a ZX6, as you do, and he was riding just so close to the bumper of this car, like we're talking maybe 30 centimeters. And had that driver, slowed down a bit, that would have been it. Like the film would have been cancelled. And so there's just all this communication that had to go on. We were running Sasha's cardo through my cardo and my helmet. And so the speakers were just kind of hanging out. And so everybody could listen to what Sasha was saying. That was one of the more difficult parts, I think, actually, was the communication between the bikes and everybody else in the crew, especially because I was the only person there that understood the equipment, and I was the only person who actually rode a motorcycle. And so trying to get everybody on the same page, especially with the communication, that was pretty difficult as well.
I want to ask about the crew actually in a minute, but before I do that, just while we're sort of talking tech a little bit, camera tech, audio tech, is that something that you, as a filmmaker, is that something that you're interested in like that whole technical side? Is that something like, can you talk lenses and cameras and color spaces? Is that something that gets you excited, or are you just like, no, I'm more interested in the human connection of the interviewing, things that we talked about earlier? Like, where do you, maybe you love all of this stuff. Tell me.
I just love being in the room where it's all happening. I'm very much a technical person. Like I could sit there and discuss which lenses might be appropriate, or like full frame cameras versus, it's all of these things go into filmmaking, I think, and a lot of those considerations happen in pre-production, because the camera that we used, the lenses that we decided to use, down to what was compatible with the gimbals in order to make sure everything was in the same color space, that all happens really, really early. And so you kind of had to decide to a point what tone you wanted to carry. We ended up going with an FX3 only because it was this full frame cinema camera. Very, very powerful, very crisp image. We could still, put on adapted prime lenses to get that really, glossy, glowy feel that all really cinematic films carry. But we could also mount it onto our gimbals. So I would have loved to go with maybe a C300 or a black magic of some kind that kind of gives that more tonal depth. But it was very practical, because we had to think about the color spaces that would carry through the whole film and things like that. So to an extent, you kind of have to be a little bit interested in the technicalities, especially if you're directing such a big and technical project like Faster Than Fair was, because being on the same page as cinematographers or your boom operators, or it's just so important.
Given that you did this through Victoria University, I assume the whole thing was edited in DaVinci Resolve?
Yes.
Is that the main editor that you work with, or do you use other, or have you had experience with other editors?
Yeah, prior to using DaVinci Resolve, which was, a pretty academic sort of reasoning for going that way, Premiere Pro is great, but you also have the Adobe subscription, which is like a curse. Once you start, you just can't. Yeah, we could have gone that route, but DaVinci has really, really good color grading integration. It's what all of the pros use. So it was important that we kind of stayed within that space, because color was hugely important in this film in the end. There are heaps of editing software out there, some that are far more accessible for people to, jump into if they've never edited things before. Yeah, like Movie Maker or iMovie. I mean, people dog on them quite a lot, but they're great for people that have never touched editing software before. Yeah, but DaVinci it's a pretty nice all-rounder.
And are you happy with how things turned out? Like, now that it's been a few months since you finished it, and I'm talking about the look of the film particularly, like, are you happy with the equipment choices and how the film ended up looking? Or do you when you watch it through again, you go, the lighting wasn't quite right there. I mean, of course, we all find our little imperfections in what we do, but are you generally like, I can live with this, move on to the next project?
Yeah, I generally am of the feeling that this film, it was my child for a really long time. And being able to step back from that entire production process and look at it with, an objective eye that hasn't worked on it for a few months now has been really refreshing. I am incredibly proud of how it all turned out. But also, even during the production, I can remember one of my crew coming to me at one point, and they had quite a stern look on their face. And I'm like, what's wrong? What's up? And he was like, I feel really uncomfortable with how much you're complimenting my work. Because I was just telling everybody that I was just so stoked with how things were turning out and that they were doing such a good job. So I had to turn things back a little bit. I was a bit too excited. But I think that's a good explanation for how I was feeling throughout the whole process. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about crew, because you took the roles of director, line producer, associate editor, storyboard artist, but it was actually a collaborative effort.
Yes.
I mean, how big was the crew?
Oh, I might have to go back through and have a look at exactly how many people touched this film, but people like crew-wise, dartboard number is like maybe 20 people that, actually got on their hands and knees and really put a lot of sweat into this film. But in terms of the people that, were collaborated with, that were talked to, I suppose, gathering information and things like that, there were probably 100 different people that put a lot of love and consideration into this project. And that really shows when you're watching the credits. And I can remember writing them all out and being like, oh, this is a lot of people have put a lot of effort into this. And there's a lot of gratitude that comes from that. It wouldn't have been the film that it was, without a single person. It was just such a collaborative effort. And that collaboration was so important for me, being a film about community. Naturally, you get a lot of people involved.
So if I think about sort of the main tech crew, and I'm thinking the camera operator, editor, color grader, and I guess producer to a certain extent, what was it like as the director having to give up? I should have mentioned the sound recordist as well, and of course the person who composed and produced the score. As a director, how did you find having to give up a certain amount of control to those other people in those other roles? And I'm always interested in, particularly, what was your relationship with the editor?
That's a really interesting question. I think for a lot of people taking on a project like this, you would have a lot of attachment to it. And as a topic that was really, near and dear to my heart, considering, my history with motorcycling and my personal grief with motorcycling, I did have quite a lot of attachment. But there was this point in kind of the pre-production before I'd even, pitched it and then gotten it selected, where I acknowledged that can be an issue in film production, especially with something that's so meaningful and so personal. And so the way that I'd approached that pre-production, straight off the bat, was making sure that everybody was collaborating and contributing in a way that was meaningful to them. So that was sitting down with the camera operators and, asking them, what shots do you want to take? What's going to be really beneficial for, your portfolio or your future happiness? And I had, single sit-down conversations with everybody. That was really important to get on the same page, but also allow people to have their own contributions. And I think there was this small part of me that worried that things wouldn't be coherent in the end, because everybody kind of has a different vision for what they want to achieve or their strengths. But what came out was this beautifully polished film that you could tell everybody had put their own style into and their own love into. And I actually think that it was a more successful film than if I had sat down and gone, this is exactly what we're doing.
Mm.
And I think that's what makes this film so unique, is that I really wanted to embrace that sense of community and individualism, especially in the crew, that is often really overlooked in creative collaboration, because people do really want to, take control and call it theirs.
So I'm now going to ask a question. You're not the first guest I've had on the podcast who I've asked this question, but do you have an opinion about auteur theory? And so for anyone who doesn't know, and I did Google this mainly because I just wanted a concise description of what auteur theory is. Auteur theory suggests that despite filmmaking being a highly collaborative process, the director imprints their distinct personal vision, stylistic choices, and thematic obsessions onto every film they make.
Mm.
So it's sort of the opposite, I guess, or the opposing theory of auteur theory is it's all about the collective of the crew. They together have made collaboratively a piece of art.
Mm.
So I just wonder, I mean, you've maybe perhaps answered that already, but given that this is quite a highly debated topic within film theory, I wondered if you had any opinion.
Mm.
And you don't need to, if you don't have an opinion and don't want to share it, that's also fine.
That's really interesting, actually. I hadn't heard of this as a concept before. I didn't know that it was a theory. But I think that there's a time and a place for it. And I think that's why it's so highly debated. Because in my film, like, while it was my concept and while it was an idea that I thought of and to an extent sort of guided people through, I wasn't telling people that their style wasn't appropriate or that it wasn't in line with telling people like that and constructing things like that just wasn't in line with the ethos of the film, I think. Again, I think there's a time and a place for it. If you were shooting a Marvel film, you want it to look and feel like Marvel. But this was it's an indie documentary, and it's about community and about people coming together and sharing their stories in their own way. And I think that it was appropriate to let people take control of their sections and their contributions to an extent. If somebody had come to me and been like, well, no, I actually want to go out and shoot people in a bakery, I'd probably say, well, that's not motorcycles. So there's a certain level of control, but I'd never want to tell somebody that their idea was, not right or that their approach wasn't appropriate.
Okay, a follow-up question. Could you have made this film if you weren't a motorcycle rider yourself?
Wow, that one's made me think, actually, because you think a lot about people making films about communities that they're not a part of or integrated with, or that they don't have sufficient background with. I think there are a few cases where people not having as much insight into a community has been a real strong suit. I think about Christelle Mosel's film The Wolf Pack, which is kind of her looking into a family that's been isolated from the real world, and all 7 of their children kind of grow up watching films to learn language. Very interesting documentary, very observational as well. In a film like that, I think it's appropriate. But I also think I wouldn't have had the idea to look into motorcycling had I not had the background. I think if people are coming at it from a really open-minded, empathetic, sensitive approach, I think it can be done well. But I think it's definitely on a per-topic basis.
Is it in any way directing you to what you might want to work on next? Are you thinking, I want another passion project that I connect to personally, or do I want to challenge myself with something that maybe I have no connection to and I come at it from a completely fresh eyes sort of approach?
I'm somebody that approaches life with a very curious outlook. And so when people tell me about things that they're passionate about, I immediately think, I would love to look into this more. I'm not sure if there's anything that sticks out to me recently that I've been like, yes, that's something that I need to capture. Because my deep belief in film is that documentary is such a great place to, share stories or voices that might not otherwise be heard. But I suppose I've always been really interested in cars. I come from quite a car-loving background, and you know, it's adjacent. So I might be interested in looking at the engineering and mechanics behind that, similar to kind of the teams and engineering behind World Superbike. It's just again very collaborative community. I think it's beautiful.
Okay, just one last question about the film. So the film makes reference to the death of 26-year-old Doc Boswick, who was killed in a motorcycle accident in November 2022. Did you know Doc at all?
I didn't know him personally, but the way that I do know about him is when I was getting into motorcycling, Doc was still so largely talked about in the Wellington community. And he influenced and touched quite a lot of people emotionally. And so going into, learning more about this community was also talking to people about their experiences with this figure who seemed to bring everybody together. And I kind of got to talking to Garth through one of his good friends who used to work under him, Zach Husson, who really helped me with getting into the community and, making friends and teaching me more about the mechanics and the engineering behind a bike so that I could actually, take care of it by myself and change my oil filter and all of these things. And what I found was that this person who I'd never had the pleasure of meeting was still bringing people together, and people still acknowledged, just how tragic and sad the loss of this person was. And with talking with people, I learned about his memorial ride, which was, hugely successful in the Wellington community. I mean, hundreds of people apparently showed up. And it brought a lot of people together. And acknowledging that, I think, was important for the film, being able to put a name to something like that. It makes it a whole lot more impactful. But with that was also a lot of ethical considerations behind, Doc's family and how it would be best appropriate to approach something like that. So I was very, very happy to get in contact with his family, and they were, again, very sensitive conversation to be had, and absolute tears that Doc was still being talked about and still, recognized and memorialized in this way. And so they gave me their blessing to include him in the film, which was just hugely important for me. And having a figure like that, which, again, influenced so many people, I think really helps, empathize with this person who's talking about a friend that he's lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I just want to take the opportunity to just ask a little bit about your training, your experience with Victoria University of Wellington. So you did a 3-year bachelor's degree in filmmaking, and then you followed that up with a 2-year master's degree. I'm assuming there was a mix of both theory and practice in the undergrad degree. Can you just maybe outline what the course covered, the 3-year course?
Yeah. So my undergrad Bachelor of Arts in film, I also did alongside a minor in media design because I found the technical side of things really interesting again. The first year was definitely very highly theoretical. You would pretty much just write essays and really indulge in the films that already existed, which a lot of people didn't like, including myself, but only because I really felt like I wanted to be there to pursue, practical endeavors in filmmaking. But in hindsight, I actually think that theory, and this is a hot take, really improved the way that I approached practical filmmaking, because it gave me a new lens on how different people, approach a creative craft. And then The second year, there was more practical components, the same with the third, but again, a lot of theory and a lot of essay writing, which I grew to love in the end. I submitted my final essay. I went, this is kind of sad. I'd actually go back and write this again. So it grows on some people.
And what about in the master's program? What was the focus of that?
Yeah, the master's program was, it was really excellent because masters are generally 2 years, but this one was one entire year, pretty much February to February. And so everything was highly condensed from what you'd get in a 2-year master's, which meant that, we weren't allowed to have jobs on the side. And it was very intense, but incredibly rewarding because the people that work out at the Miramar Creative Center are, industry professionals. They know exactly what they're talking about. They've been color graders on big films or sound designers. And so people really approached it with quite a world-class perspective, which I appreciated because the undergraduate was kind of all about expressing your creative identity rather than strengthening those skills in a professional capacity, I suppose, going out into the wider industry. And the facilities at the Miramar Creative Center as well were just excellent. I'd go in every day, just so excited to learn and pick up new pieces of equipment, and they really get you ready for a broader industry application.
Miramar is for people who don't know, is also the home of one of the homes of Peter Jackson's post-production facility, isn't it? What's the relationship between or is there any relationship between the creative center and Weta Workshop?
Yeah, there were a couple of times that we'd had the pleasure of going through and talking to people at Weta, and it was great seeing what those spaces looked like and the people that are really applying themselves practically in such a rigorous industry. I think the master's was great for that because you got to connect with a lot of people. We also had Park Road just down the way too. And so that's a lot of like the post-production facilities. I never personally got to go in there, but I know that some of the design adjacent masters, got to have, I believe James Cameron came in and looked over their work. So the connections in the network that you get are pretty incredible.
Yeah, well, is James Cameron a New Zealander now? Did he take a passport? I can't remember.
I have no idea, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, he loves New Zealand. Doesn't he live in the Wairarapa now, I think? But he loves Wellington. He loves New Zealand. So okay, we'll have him, I guess. Just one final question before we sort of look at wrapping things up. Am I right in thinking that you're basically finding yourself gravitating towards documentary making, given that in your academic training you would have been exposed to all sorts of different types of film genres? Why is that, and what is it about documentary making that you find so appealing?
I think with all filmmaking, you get a sense of human connection that you might not get in other industries, but it's especially strong in documentary. And as somebody, again, who's very curious about the world around me and just always looking to learn from others and really actively listen to stories I might not otherwise get the privilege of hearing, documentary just, it facilitates that in a way that I don't think many other industries facilitate. The stories that you come out with and the people that you talk to are all so passionate about what they do, but they're also very like-minded in that sense that they're there to learn more. And I like being around spaces like that.
Okay, so we are on the home straight, Brooke. With regards to your own filmmaking, who have you taken inspiration from and who would you recommend others to watch?
I have a lot of inspiration that goes into my work, and they're all so different. It's a bit of an amalgamation, but my biggest influence in filmmaking is probably Bong Joon-ho, and it's not so much about the content of his films, but the way that he approaches his films. He's a very methodical, precise, planned filmmaker. You have a look at his storyboards of his films, and he has every single shot laid out with the lenses and exactly where he wants everybody, which takes such a keen eye to get to that point. And so someday I aspire to be that prepared. But he's also somebody that shows and doesn't tell everything. And I think Faster Than Fear took a lot from that as well, being able to sit with things and impose your own meaning onto them, not necessarily telling people how they should feel. I'd say a lot of the technical elements and considerations that went into that film. I was watching a lot of this motorcycling filmmaking YouTuber called Jay Jankulovsky. Believe I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm so sorry if I'm not. But he goes into a lot of detail about different camera mounts and how to approach color grading when your image is blown out from how bright the sun is on an action camera. I learned a lot about ND filters from his channel, which was highly important for a project like this. And then in a more niche way, a lot of my color space that's used in this film, you'll notice it's a lot of browns. It's a lot of desaturation. It's really gritty. It's but in a way, really clean and kind of warm. And I took a lot of inspiration from the time that I worked at a cafe in Wellington, which I highly recommend going to, called West 2 Espresso. They have the best coffee I've had in my life, and I will die on that bed. But the lady that owns it, Abby Dorrington, she's a very talented photographer. And so she has all of these prints of her own work up on the wall in the cafe. And they have a very similar tone in that they're a bit desaturated for New Zealand landscapes, but it's an interesting juxtaposition because New Zealand is often captured as a very saturated green environment. And I wanted it to be a bit more digestible for international viewers who might not understand that. Yeah, and so looking at those every day was definitely gave me a bit of color space inspiration. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Does the filming enhance or diminish the pleasure of a motorcycle ride for you?
I'd say it enhances it. I always have so much fun when I'm out on the bike. And a lot of people film their rides for safety reasons, but I used to mount my Insta360 Ace Pro on my chin, on my helmet, and I'd film all my rides because I really loved watching them back and seeing all the moments that I missed. I'd often be on some group rides, but sometimes just by myself. And I don't know, even now, as somebody who doesn't currently own a bike, it's nice to look back on because you can kind of still get that feeling of when you were there. So I quite enjoy it. I don't think about the fact it's recording when it is recording. I'm very much still in the moment, but it's nice to look back on.
Thanks so much for being my guest today, Brooke. Now's your chance to tell folk where they can find and follow you online, and perhaps also if you can tell the audience where they might be able to see Faster Than Fear.
You're more than welcome to check me out on most socials. Brooke Darrow is a pretty uncommon name, so I'll probably be the first person to come up. Unfortunately, due to festival regulations, I can't have the film on public release just yet, but if you watch my socials, hopefully you'll have something by the end of the year, and I'm so excited to show everybody.
Excellent. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that once I'm aware that it's publicly available, I'll also put it out on the Real Riders podcast as well. Look, super. Thanks again for being here today. Take care, and when you do get a chance to ride again, ride safe.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.